Colonel,
Yes, sir.
if you'll come on up here and I will formally introduce you to our group. If you don't mind, I'm going to read this so I don't get too...
Please don't, not all.
Okay.
Okay, that's it.
Colonel Toliver is a Top Gun fighter pilot and protege of the famed Tuskegee Airmen. He was mentored, trained, and commissioned under their tutelage. He retired from the Air Force after 26 years of dedicated service, including 2 tours in Southeast Asia and 446 combat missions. There's got to be a medal in there somewhere. And those included, that's the reason why you said Southeast Asia. Just name the countries.
North and South Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand, Laos, that's the area. That's the areas we're going.
So you got a pretty good overview of that area.
Yes, sir, I did.
Since retiring from the Air Force, Colonel Toliver pursued several businesses, economic development, and political ventures in New Mexico, Alabama, Georgia, and Texas. Public service includes several years in the New Mexico and on the Public Safety Advisory Commission, Board of Regents, University of New Mexico, Board of Directors of Kirtland Partnership Committee. Since moving to Arizona in 2003, he has served on the Board of Directors for the West Valley Hospital in Goodyear and held a key role in securing the Congressional Gold Medal for the Tuskegee Airmen. And that probably was a pretty big task to get
Yes,
that
it was.
done.
400 members of the House, 99 senators
Yeah,
on the
that's
list.
huge. He continues to be in demand as a motivational speaker, and I think I sent most of this out to you already. So he has got several subjects that he's very astute in, and the subject I asked him to address today is on the Tuskegee Airmen heritage. So with that, Colonel,
Thank you.
you have the floor.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Then maybe I don't need this. Can you all hear me back there?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Please use it.
Oh, okay, he wants me to use it. All right. Well, let me first say that I'm very pleased to be here with you this evening. The story of the Tuskegee Airmen is an exciting story. It's part of American story. It's part of American history. Many times people think of it as just a period during World War II. But I'm going to give you an expansive view tonight. It goes back to the very genesis of who they were, why they are, and still are. And what I really want you to be able to do is that as you embrace the American history, then any part of it is your history as well. And so my history is your history. My service was your service. And I think there's most of you here are veterans here today, is that right? Army, Navy, Air Force, Coast Guard, Merchant Marines, housewives, daughters, children, all the other above, you see, and so that's who we are. And Denise is going to help me here. We tried that little slide, it didn't work, but these units here, these are the 4 fighter squadrons to the left that you might see here, and then the 4 bomber squadrons to the right. The basic unit was the 332nd Fighter Group and the 477th Bombardment Group, which I'll explain. These are pictures of some of the people that reflect that era and some of which I knew all along my way. Next slide. Now, to understand the Tuskegee Airmen story, as I said, you wouldn't believe or think when you think in the Tuskegee Airmen story or the veterans of World War II or the Spanish American soldiers and so forth. But you have to go back and look at the very genesis of this country. We are made up of people from so many ethnic groups in America, and we don't often give credit to that. The Tuskegee Airmen, as black men and women, the Tuskegee Airmen, it was both men and women. But you have to expect that it didn't just begin in World War II. And if you consider the fact that the first slaves were brought to America in about 1620, And then 1621, I believe, the Pilgrims came. Is that correct? 1620. So they both came at the same time. We had some to the north and some going to the south. But by 1770, there was an event that took place, which I'm going to show you in just a bit. But that was the beginning. Ethnic group before that is part of who we are today. And I'm sure that you can go back, or you know somebody that can go back in their heritage, and they will find all of these different kinds of people, you know, that anchored our patriotism and our service to the country. Next slide, please. Okay, let's get to it. Early American heroes and heroines. The young man that died on the Boston Square in 1770, he was one of the Crispus Attucks. Who has ever heard of that? Okay, one or two. There were 5 young men, 4 white and 1 black, and they stood up against the redcoats on the Boston Square in 1770. And they were protesting, and they were all killed, shot summarily. The first to fall was Crispus Attucks, and thus the first blood shed and the beginning of the American Revolution was that of a black man. We move forward now to 1917, 1918. Who has ever heard of Eugene Jacques Ballard? Ever heard of him? He was a black man coming from a family of about 13 down in Georgia somewhere, and he heard about the things happening in World War II. We talked about Frank Luke and so on, right? Well, Eugene Jacques Ballard made his way to France, joined the French on the ground, fought in the trenches with them, became a highly decorated soldier on the ground, and when the time was over, they said, well, do you want to do anything else? He says, yeah, I want to go fly those airplanes that have been flying over our heads. And so, summarily, he went off to pilot training, got his wings, and participated in aerial combat before the war ended. He was known as the Black Swallow of Death to the Axis powers. He was known, and so Frank Luke wasn't the only one that was making a name for himself, but this young man, Eugene Jacques Ballard, was the first black man from America to fly in the war with the French. He came back highly decorated. I think he had the highest decoration from the French when he returned back to the States in about 1918. Who's ever heard of Bessie Coleman? Long before Amelia Earhart, there was a young woman, seems the number in those days was 13. She came from a family of 13 out of Texas somewhere, made her way from Oklahoma up to Chicago area, and heard about the guys and the exploits of flying overseas. She got a French book, taught herself how to speak French, saved her monies working in a beauty shop somewhere, and made her way to France, and found her way to a French school, and was allowed to train. She became the first woman in America to earn her pilot wings overseas. She came back and began to fly in demonstrations and so on, and very tragically, at age 36, she was killed while preparing for a demonstration. She was known as Queen Bess, and she was so famous that people would come out to the fields to see her doing acrobatics and so on, and she made her statement that she would not fly if black people and others could not come to see her perform. And so out in the cornfields, or the fudge fields, wheat fields, wherever, she flew all across this country, and Bessie Coleman was the first black woman, first woman to get her pilot license and come back and fly to America. Next slide. Now, as I said, the history of America is filled with black people, others, minorities participating. But by 1925, the powers that be in the military decided we need to put a stop to these guys. They're just getting too far ahead of themselves, and we don't want them going higher than they were in World War I. Black people had demonstrated their capabilities in World War I. And so the War Department decided to write a document in 1925 and publish that document as history and as the way the military was going to go. And it said that black people were inferior to whites in every discipline. African Americans were not brave in battle. They were unreliable on the fire, and they didn't have the necessary acumen and so on to manage the machines of war that were being developed. the thing that I kind of put my tongue in cheek, and is that they say, well, they don't like to fight. And I wonder if anybody came to my neighborhood to determine if that were so. But that was not so. And the history, of course, the real history, proves that wasn't so. Now, this was the document that guided and kept black people from participating in such things as aviation and other disciplines in the military. Next slide, please. Not to be outdone, two young men from Chicago, Del White and Chauncey Spencer, borrowed an old airplane and says, well, look, we need to go to Washington and tell our story. But before they left, they met a young man from Illinois. His name was Everett Dirksen. Anybody ever hear that name? The senator, the great senator. And a young senator from Kansas called Harry S. Truman. You ever hear that name? And they said, well, look, we want to come visit you, and we want to get your support because we need to be able to participate in the war that's coming. We can see it. And if we don't stop the Nazis that we're hearing about, or the imperialists in the Pacific, America is going to become slaves again. We don't need that to happen. So we need to be able to fight, we need to be able to train, we need to be able to fly airplanes and all of those things. So these guys basically put together an old aircraft with baling wire and chewing gum. They didn't have any place to land, they had no place to spend the nights, but they skipped and hopped across fields from Chicago all the way to Washington, D.C. And there up on an old field one day, a young man by the name of Harry Truman met them. And he couldn't believe this contraption that they had flown all across the country. And his words were, well, if you guys are crazy enough to fly this thing here, I'm going to help you do what you need to do to really learn to fly. And so that began a program. Next slide, please. The program that came up was something that enabled, did we get it? Okay, these are the other people that were dispelled in the light, but let's go there. Okay, the Civilian Pilot Training Program became a program whereby 6 historically black colleges were going to be allowed to train black men primarily to fly airplanes. Tuskegee Institute, later where I was to go to school, was the one that was leaning forward mostly. It had land, it had buildings, it had facilities that were willing to allow these men to come from all across America to begin a flying training program. So Tuskegee in Alabama, which means little warrior in Native American language, was the place that was selected. Not only because they stood forward, but those who thought that the program would fail says, let's do it in Alabama, the cradle of the Confederacy. We know it won't get off the ground. And so that was another reason, why this program got started, and now 1941. Next. Okay. This man, we call him Chief Anderson. He was an early black pioneer aviator, taught himself to fly, came out of Pennsylvania, and was hired to come down to Tuskegee and began the flying training program, built the airfield, set the program in motion, and he was considered the father of black aviation. Years later, I was to meet this man, and I'll have a side story about who he was and how he so impacted the program. The beginning of the program was, they brought men and women, by the way. Let's go to the next slide. Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., the first, turns out later he's going to be the first general officer in the Air Force. His dad was the first general officer in the military. His dad was a one-star general. And when Benjamin was 12 years old, living in Washington, D.C., his dad took him out in one of those barnstorming things and gave him a ride, paid for a ride, and he got a ride in an aircraft. And he said, Dad, I want to fly airplanes. Not only that, I want to go to the military academy. And so it was in 1932, this young man was one of the handful of guys that were allowed to go to the Air Force and go to the U.S. Military Academy. During the 4 years that he was there, he was given what was called a silent treatment. He didn't have any roommates, he didn't have any whites to talk to him. The only people that would speak to him were given orders, He ate by himself. If they were going on training, he had to go to the field by himself and so on. Even so, 278 guys graduated in his class, and he ranked 35 out of that. To say he was a bright young man was indeed an understatement. And he launched his career as a Tuskegee Airman at Moulton Field in World War II. He was the one that won in the first class. Go ahead, the next one, please. Okay. He was one of the first students. But now, I want to mention this story. Mrs. Roosevelt. Who ever heard of Mrs. Roosevelt? Eleanor, did you know she had a major hand in the Tuskegee Airmen story? You've heard that story. There was another woman that you don't see, and I didn't have this here, but there was another woman, Mary McLeod Bethune. She was a black educator, very close friends with Eleanor, and she was known to be, or allegedly, the first black woman, a black person, to have dinner in the White House with Eleanor and the president. She did become the kitchen cabinet minister to Roosevelt. She was the one, we believe, that said to Eleanor, look, I know you're going to Alabama. When you get down there, get over to Tuskegee and see for yourself that these guys are actually training. They really are learning to fly. And thus, Eleanor says, I'm going to take you up on it, Mary. And when she came to the South on this for another business, she came over to where the Tuskegee Airmen were flying. And the man that I showed you earlier, Chief Anderson, was the one that you see here. He was the one who actually flew her. And before she took off, the Secret Service, we heard directly from the chief that they were having a conniption fit because she's going to jump in an open cockpit with a black pilot and go flying. Now, the local boys were kept away out beyond the fence. They were not allowed to come in because the First Lady was there, and then, you know, the guys made sure they weren't going to start something. They were having a conniption fit when they saw the First Lady take off with this black pilot, and away they go. And so she flew around for about an hour or so. She came back, and then the story goes that she called her husband and says, yes, indeed, these boys can fly. We need to get them into the war. Okay, next slide. But she had a major hand in that. So by 1941, the first group was started. B.O. Davis, as I said, was one of the first to go. George, and I met B.O. Davis when I was a student at Tuskegee. I met George Spanky Roberts there as well the same year, and many others that I met when I got to Tuskegee just 12 years after World War II, and I just jumped ahead. But these are the people that I knew coming up. Next slide, please. And the next slide. World War II begins. Now, there should be some, okay, I got that, I'm just going to stay with it right now. Just got to keep clicking it. Who knows where you were in 1939? Anybody?
I was a preschooler.
Preschooler. Anybody else here born before 1939? Okay, that's 3 of us. All right. I had no idea any of that was happening, but by 1941, or 42 actually, we were chased out of the land where I was born in northern Louisiana. And we made our way to California by way of Phoenix, by the way. And then after these events took place, next slide, the war was going on, and by the time I got to California, or was going through here, 1942-43, the Tuskegee Airmen were finally given a chance to go overseas and participate in aerial combat. They initially were sent to North Africa. They had older airplanes, but eventually they were able to start the movement all across North Africa into Italy, and by 1944 they were at a place called Ramatelli, Italy, and where they set the records of escorting bomber aircraft from Europe, other European bases. Now, you've heard stories about never losing a bomber and so on. The fact of the matter is they lost a few, but no other escort unit outperformed these black pilots in World War II. They had the most outstanding record of support. They also had an outstanding record, which you'll see here in a bit. Let's go to the next slide now. When the war, by the time the war was over, they had graduated 996 black pilots. 996. We have less than 250 black pilots in the Air Force today. Okay, that's another story. But from 1941 to 1946, that's how many graduated. 450 went to combat, and then you can see the statistics here. 15,000 missions or sorties were flown, and they came home with 150 distinguished flying crosses, 744 medals, and all that, to say the least. They came back highly decorated. These men prove their worth. Now, by the way, the total Tuskegee experience included 15,000 people, men and women. Many of the men were, of course, aviators or on airplanes. Many of the women were nurses. They were supply clerks. Anything that the rest of the military was doing, these people did it. So a total of about 15,000 people were involved in what was called the Tuskegee experience. Next slide, please.
Colonel, they were not integrated, is really what you're saying. That's the reason why they had the total support package and they were all belonged.
Yes, it was a totally segregated unit. It started out with white instructors and white leaders. Over the course of time, they replaced these people with black people, and especially those who've been in the war and coming back. But there were several white leaders who were renowned in making sure that the program succeeded. Noel Parrish was one of such individuals. His wife still is today a significant contribution to furthering the cause of the Tuskegee Airmen. There was another unit, the bombardment unit. These guys were flying B-25s, and they had several bases, Selfridge, Godman Field, Freeman Field. While they didn't get to combat, but they were breaking the barriers down for the segregation in the military. At one point, over 100 of them were arrested and charged for violating military rules simply because they were trying to go into the officers' club at Selfridge base where they were serving. But it was segregated, and the wing commander, the base commander says you can't do that. They got arrested, and some of those cases lasted for over 50 years, and they finally got exonerated. But by the time the war was over in the Pacific and Europe, these two had been part of the contribution. Next, please. So, here's the impact. The success of the Tuskegee Airmen proved to the American public and the world that African Americans, when given an opportunity, could become effective military leaders, pilots, and so on and so forth. Thousands of those in experience returned to America to continue. They became doctors, and lawyers, and educators, and they were involved in all manner of progress in this country. Yet, they were still faced with, back in the 40s and early 50s, rigid segregation, especially in the South and in other parts of the country. But they stood up to fight. They didn't quit. And they weren't out fighting in a very confrontational way. Rarely did that occur, but they worked behind the scenes to get things done, and they made a significant difference. Next slide. To be certain, when the leaders, here's now the Senator Harry Truman, now President Truman, he paid attention to what these guys were doing. And by 1947, he says, look, not only did the Tuskegee Airmen, but the Japanese Americans, the Native Americans, the code talkers, all of these people have made enormous contributions to us winning the war. And I'm going to integrate this military so that these guys are given a chance. And so on September 18th, 1947, the President issued an executive order to integrate the services, all branches, and so on. It took approximately 15 years before we had substantive integration in military bases, many especially across the South. Next slide. Something else. Who's ever heard of Top Gun?
Oh, yeah.
It's heard of Top Gun. Saw the movie? Tom Cruise, did you like the movie? You know he's just an actor, right?
Still is.
Well, would you know a Top Gun if you saw one? Take a look. This is one. The real deal. I'm blessed to be able to say that. I was a Top Gun as a young captain in 1972 after finishing the school and went right back to Southeast Asia at the time. But when I was at the Top Gun school, nobody ever told me, nor was there any record, that the very first Top Gun pilots were Tuskegee Airmen. The trophy that they won in 1949 was hidden to the records and the archives of the military. It wasn't until about 15 years ago, maybe 20 years ago, that the trophy that was won, the one that you see here by these Tuskegee Airmen, was found in the bowels of the Air Force Museum in Ohio. Okay, now these guys were allowed to come down and take a picture at the hotel downtown, but they were not allowed to stay for the dinner. So the very first Top Gun pilots in the United States Air Force was none other than a Tuskegee Airman. How's that for a trick? Okay, when I graduated from the school in 1972, there were only about 20 or so black pilots had gone through the program, and it's 21 years or so. And so that's where my heritage goes back to as well. And so we proudly say, yep, I graduated from the Top Gun school. I went back to Vietnam and did what I was supposed to do. Next slide, please. Okay. Next, go to the next one. We didn't stop. In 1953, some of you know where you were, right? 1953? Anybody served during that time? I don't think so, huh? But you were growing up during that time. I was in high school and trying to get there. Just couldn't get there. I wasn't old enough, quite old enough. But I was in high school, and I was saying, well, I need to get to a flying school because I don't want to go if I can't fly. And that was born way back in World War II. But next slide, please. All gave some gave all. And here we see the things that were happening at that time. The Tuskegee Airmen continued to participate. Keep flipping, please. Now here's a story I want to tell you about. Anybody ever hear of Jesse Leroy Brown? This young man was the first black Navy pilot, but he was also one of the first to give his life in Korea. The thing that makes his story so unique is that they were bombing targets up in the north part of Korea, and he was shot down and crash landed. His buddy, the guy over here to the left, tried to keep the bad guys off until they could get some support in. Couldn't do that. He crash landed his aircraft to go over to where Leroy was trapped in his airplane and tried to fight to get him out. But he was not able to extricate him from the aircraft, and ultimately when the helicopter got there, they had to leave, and Jesse, of course, by then was mostly dead, and so the other gentleman, I thought I had his name there. I don't have his name, but he wound up getting a Congressional Medal of Honor for his service of trying to save his black buddy. And that's where the slogan came, no man should die alone. So he was there on the ground trying to get, oh, there's his name. Is it Thomas J. Hutner is that man's name. Last year, I finally met somebody in his family. I met his niece, by the way, in passing, and he's still alive, not doing well, but quite aged. Others continued. Marine pilot Pete Peterson became a 3-star general in the Marine Corps. Other nurses reached the heights of colonels in the service. You ever heard of Chappie James, Daniel Chappie James, right? He was going to become the first black 4-star. I served under Chappie James at Davis Mountain Air Force Base in 1965. So what is that, 51 years ago, when I started my Air Force pilot career, I served under this man, who was an original Tuskegee Airman down at Davis Mountain. That's my connection to Arizona. Next slide, please. The legacy continues. William E. Brown was another Tuskegee Airman. I met and served under William E. Brown when he was a lieutenant colonel, and he went on to become a 3-star. B.O. Davis Jr., I told you, I met him at Tuskegee. He died July 4th, 2002. He was awarded finally the 4th star by President Clinton before he passed away. He had earned it, but he was never awarded it. So just before he passed away, and quite aged, President Clinton awarded him his 4th star. Charles McGee, a renowned fighter pilot and a great leader to this day, 97 years old. This man became my personal mentor back in 1968 at Hahn Air Base, Germany. He's one of the greatest officers, greatest gentlemen that I've ever met, and I try to emulate my life, pattern my life after him. Vietnam veterans. Now we're getting there, okay? We know this. This was a time when things weren't great in America, for many of us. Next slide, please. Keep on going, please. But our young men went and they served. Forgive me. Every day I live, every day I get up, I remember we left 58,000 young men behind. We couldn't bring them back. They lost their lives. Keep going, please.
And women.
And women, yes, of course. I was stationed with the first nurses that ever come into combat at Cameron Bay in 1966. One of my books back here will tell that story about these nurses. Both of them tell that story. Tim Body and I served together at Cameron Bay. Now Colonel James is a deputy commander, and Eddie Lavelle is one of my mentors as well. These were the guys, these were my neighbors and friends, guys who also, Tuskegee Airman, Lowell Bell, retired colonel, Cal Jeffries, the late Cal Jeffries, gave his life for his country after he left the military. Next slide, please. And during my time, I had the privilege of flying with another man. I don't know why we can get the other picture there. Hit it again. Okay, here we go. We were three black boys from the South. I was from North Louisiana, Shreveport. Hal Brown was from New Orleans. Gene Jackson was from Lufkin, Texas. We were all serving together. We weren't really trying to set a record, but while we were there, we were flying our hearts out. We were making sure that it could never be said that, no, we don't fight, we can't fly, we don't fight, or we don't do our job. But the record speaks for itself right there. 1,391 combat missions in Southeast Asia. My buddy over there, Hal Brown, was so disappointed because he missed by one. Okay? We were in a competition. And right up until the time he dies, he said, Dick Toliver, I'm never going to forgive you. You had one more mission than me. But bless his heart, Gene was killed in an accident, Hal died with cancer. But we were three of the closest guys flying and serving our country with everything that we had to give and everything that we could muster. And I have to tell you here that this was one of the greatest privileges I've ever had in my life, is to have a fellow African-American who fly. Hal was a backseater, so he flew with me. Gene was one of my students at one time. He was my young protege. And so I had to tell you about these three because they were very significant. We are the legacy of the Tuskegee Airmen. Next slide, please. Relevance of today. 1972, we started a program called Tuskegee Airmen. And we have over 50 chapters around the country today. And I can just tell you that our primary purpose today is to continue to do what I'm doing, tell the story in a very colorful way if we can. But what you don't see tonight, and you'll see in, excuse me, in just a moment, the other part of my life is reaching out, going into the schools, working with city officials, working with educators, working with faith-based groups to try to reach our young people that are still needing to be inspired and encouraged. And with the way things are going here in our country today, I can tell you tomorrow I will be meeting with the chief of police of one of our major cities and his staff. And then the following week I will be meeting with the governor's staff. And what are we meeting for? To find ways to reach our young people and try to reach them to head off some of the things that they're missing today. Many of these kids that are underrepresented, as you know, do not have homes like many of you provided for your children. And so they say, well, we ought to start at home. Well, there are no homes. When single parents are out there, mothers in particular, these boys that are growing up, especially minority boys, don't know what it means to make it in this world today. I've had the privilege of taking my experience and bringing it back to try to help make a difference in our society. That's my mission today. That's the other part of the Tuskegee Airmen mission all across America. So what we started out as aviators, you know, well over 75 years ago, the work continues, and we're not done. I'm not retiring, by the way. There is no retirement for me. And why is that so? Why is that so? Many years ago, when I met Dr. Martin Luther King, and I tell the story in one of my books, he said to us, several things that night that I heard him speak way back in 1957, September, at Tuskegee. It says, look, it isn't so much what you call young people, it's what you answer to that matters. And he said, look, don't be concerned about somebody riding your back. If you stand up like a man, nobody can ride your back. That made sense to me, right? And then he said, look, don't ever quit, don't stop, because in the service of the Lord, it's always too soon to quit. And at age 65, 13 years ago, I finally said, okay, Dr. King, I'm going to take you at your word. I tore up my retirement papers 13 years ago. And so I shall now attempt to retire again. As long as God gives me the energy and the wherewithal, I will be somewhere trying to reach the children in our community. And if there's an older person that's still trying to find his way, I will also, I will also reach out to them. All right, I'm going to stop here. So there's more, but I want to leave now for questions. But this basically summarizes, we provide programs today to the youngsters. We have outreach programs, we have flying programs, and we take kids on field trips out of the base, out of the airport, and so on. But we're trying desperately to reach young kids. And it isn't just kids that are minorities or kids that are in trouble, it's all kids. Because we want all of our kids to be exposed to the great legacy of the Tuskegee Airmen, and we want to be able to influence them as much as we can. Many of us have been very successful in life, and we want to share that as much as possible. To wit, this is why I'm here today. This is not about selling books or anything, but it's sharing with you what we're doing, and then ask you, wherever you want to, perhaps get back with me later if you want to participate in helping us with kids, or however you want to do it. I have some cards back here, and I'll be happy to give them to you. Okay, well, that's a snapshot of the Tuskegee Airmen story in a very personal way, and I hope that it's been educational and interesting to you tonight.
Very good.
All right? Now, are there any questions that I might answer? Yes, sir.
Colonel, in 1972 you were in Top Gun training. What base?
I was at Nellis Air Force Base.
That's interesting because I was stationed in weapons safety at Nellis Air Force Base in 1972.
Yeah, what part of the base were you?
I was in the
Wing headquarters?
in the right,
And right there, the 57th Wing.
right, 57th Fighters Weapons Wing.
Well, I was next door in the 422nd. Okay, but I went to school up next door to the Thunderbirds.
Wow.
And then when I came back in '73, after a year in Vietnam, and I was
Right.
assigned to the 422nd Test Squadron, and I left there to come here to test the F-15 at Luke in '74.
Small world. Too bad I didn't
Yeah.
run into you.
Yeah, well,
I was a lieutenant at the time.
Yeah, lieutenant. I was a captain, so
Yeah.
you didn't have to say, hey,
That's
buddy,
right.
here you are. And so, yeah, how long did you stay there?
I got out in 75.
Okay. I was here at Luke in '75.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for your service.
Thank you.
Okay, you've been.
Well, I have a question for you.
Yes, sir.
Where did the Thunderbirds actually get started?
Luke.
You're not supposed to.
Yeah. I can tell you who wrote the program.
Who did?
B.O. Davis Jr., serving at the Pentagon. The guy that you saw, B.O. Davis Jr.,
Right.
wrote up the program when he was a staff officer at the Pentagon.
Oh, really?
Okay, and when they finally got the program off the ground, Nellis became the home of the fighter pilots. Did you say Luke? It probably did. But I was going to say, there were some guys who were the forerunners, actually did it in Europe. They were called the Trailblazers, I think they were called. And so they flew F-86s.
Aerial.
Yeah, aerial demonstration team. 84s, it started with the 84s. That was the first Thunderbird aircraft,
Didn't
the
know that.
F-84s.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
What is your opinion about our educational system, particularly when it gets into history?
We are not shining examples in our education system all across America today. And there's a lot of reasons for that. You know, we need to do a better job everywhere in educating our children. History just being part of it. Because kids don't know history anymore. They don't know geography. They don't know how this country was formed and the price of freedom that's been paid. And part of the reason is that, let me give you the typical day of a school teacher. She's got to come to class and have an array of different children with a multiplicity of needs. She's got to be a caretaker, a nurse, a social worker, you name it, and that's what he or she faces before she opens up the book to try to teach reading, writing, and arithmetic. They've got to comply with so many externalities today that are considered political correct ways to teach school. And this is really put together by people who probably don't have children, okay? So the task of the educators is pretty tough in the world in which we live in. But if we don't have a top-down structure at the state level, as an example, that is working to ensure that we educate our children here in Arizona, we can't expect them to go out and compete in the world. American students largely are at the bottom rung of some of the so-called Western nations or educated nations in math and science. They're like 21, 22, and in some cases they're down to 30 out of where kids in Thailand or in Taiwan or in Japan, where 98% of the children are in school every day in Japan. Approximately those who are going to be in the inner circle of China with 1.3 billion people, they got more kids in school than we've got in population. Okay, so there are a lot of problems there. It isn't just history, but we're missing out in the science, technology, and engineering. What we do with our program is that we try to reach kids and get them immersed in these programs as best we can. Does that answer your question in any way?
Pretty much. I'm sitting next to a teacher.
Yeah.
She's a great.
Well, let me just say this. Teachers are like military. You're like military soldiers. Did you know that? And here's why. First, you have to answer the call to be an educator or a teacher. It's something that takes place in the heart. You have to be willing to get down in the trenches to fight. And sometimes it's bloody down in those trenches, in the schoolhouses today. Sometimes it's dangerous, okay? And you got to find a way to capture that brain of a child that's intransigent, otherwise obnoxious, untrainable, or whatever. You got to convince that child that he or she should make an attempt to learn. And then when you get done doing all that, and I talked about your day and the things you do in the course of the day, you come home, you're tired, and you're weary, and you got bills to pay. And then you look at your paycheck every month and go, geez, I need to be making more, but I'm not. And I'm going to look at this for 20 years. Guess what? I'm not going to retire rich. All right? And I know, by the way, I don't always get medals or recognition for what I do. Does that sound like teacher? That's what military people are. Is that right, guys? Okay, so we're much alike. You didn't know you were a soldier, right? Now you do. I saw a hand back here. Yes, ma'am.
Aren't we more concerned with the sports after school than we are teaching our children about our American history and principles of math and science?
Well, it would appear, I'm all for sports. All of my kids were athletes in school, and my wife and I participated with them in it, you know, but we also had a rule. If you're not doing the best you can do in school, you're off the team, okay? And so, there's a couple of times I set my boy down, and he was a star running back in high school. But I set him down because he didn't perform in math the way he could have in one semester. So, you know, but parents got to be involved. I think, you know, athletics is good, but that's kind of the culture that we see out there today. Every kid comes along nowadays, and you know, he wants to be a Michael Jordan or a Bird or something like that. They don't understand that for every Michael Jackson or a Bird or whatever, there's bazillion failures. But he thinks that he can be that and so forth. But if the kid's willing, and he really thinks, or she thinks that she can perform, then as parents we try to encourage them. But you know, we let them know it's going to take a lot of work, a lot of practice, a lot of everything. But education, your grades are number one, okay? Now that takes parental involvement. And it's the parent. I don't care, it's kind of like this. I don't care what the school is doing. Well, I care, but I'm not going to let the school dictate what my child learned in school. And my wife and I had that attitude all the way. You know, I served on the PTA boards and all that, but we saw to it that our children were getting the best education that they could. And we were in military schools overseas and bases and so forth. We didn't always have the best conditions for kids in school, but we had to stay involved. And if we do that, if parents do that, we encourage parents to do that. I don't care if it is a public school system, the kids can learn. You know, all of our children, we have 3 kids biologically, we have 5 more adopted. All of them went to public schools. And I think the number is like 4 or 5 of them got college degrees, 2 went to the Air Force Academy, and 1 finished with honors at a major university, and so on and so forth. But it took involvement. And that's what we try to do, by the way, when we go out and we try to engage parents into caring and trying to make things better for the kids. Okay?
Well, you're saying what I've said all along, goes back to the home.
Yes, ma'am. If there's a home,
Yes.
if there's a home, very sadly, government agents today and schools are having to do what doesn't happen at home because the home is so dysfunctional. If you got a single parent, or you got a community of people, and I'd say this hurts my heart to say it, but it's true. 75% of black children today are being born out of wedlock. Okay? And you can't blame that on white folk, you can't blame it on law enforcement, you can't blame it on anybody but people that are gonna have to deal with it. And by the way, they don't like it when I come out and say that, but I do. And I get in the faces of people and said, look, I don't know what you can do, but you know, when I served on the board at this hospital here, one of the reasons I stepped down because we could not implement what I thought were some safeguards against people walking in the door, the 3rd and 4th child, illegitimately. And I got to tell you that. And I said, well, no, we got to see him, we got to give him payments. And I said, well, I don't want to get off on that because you probably don't like the answer. There's a way to put a stop to it, okay?
Well, unfortunately, society rewards that
Yeah.
behavior through
That's right.
financial, and that's basically your living
That's
on a
right.
day-to-day basis.
Yeah.
So when you start incentivizing the wrong behavior, what do you think? You think it's going to stop?
Yeah. But these are the things that, you know, so as an aside, we're not a social, whatever it is, but we care. I'm talking about Tuskegee Airmen, our wives, our children, our people involved today. We do care about children. We do care about the youth. And we're trying to do everything we can. I know many of you are doing that too. And I would simply say, encourage you to keep on doing it. If we save one child, then we've done something. And it's not going to get any better, so we just have to keep working and not give up. There's an old saying that says, goes like this, do not get weary in doing good, but you shall reap the harvest if you think not. Have you ever heard that before? That's scriptural, by the way. Okay, so there it is. All right, sir, that's it.
Well, one more thing
Yes.
that I wanted to ask you about. Would you explain a little bit about your books?
Yes, I will. Of the life and the world in which I grew up in, going all the way back to 1942, and looking at the world and living through all of the things that were happening. Some of you lived through some of these things, depending on where you were. The racial issues, the civil rights struggles, the loss of a president, the Vietnam War, the World War II, the Korean War, and all of those things. There were dynamics happening, and I have attempted to give a perspective on how do you navigate through life when you're facing adversity. So that's basically the theme of the book. It's adversity, victory over adversity, okay? And the kinds of things that some of you have experienced. But there's also a personal story in that book called An Uncaged Eagle about reaching a point in my life through trial and through tribulation to one day work out of the cage of anger, bitterness, hatred, prejudice, bias. I had a lot of that. I had a lot of anger because I thought I had reason to be angry because of the way I'd been dealt the cards in life. Well, you know, you were dealt some bad cards too, and you had to overcome those things. But I give that perspective. So the book of An Uncaged Eagle talks about that, and it talks about the victories in life, and it's meant to encourage, motivate, and inspire people, and also to confirm for you that your struggles in life were well worth the struggle because you are what you are today because of what you had to overcome, okay? And I hope that, and I try to make the case in that book, The Uncaged Eagle, there needs to be a time when we get over these things in life. You know, sickness, death, disappointments, all of those things are going to be as long as there's life. But we cannot afford to dwell on that such that it takes away our joy. You know, I learned from a Japanese American whose parents were immigrants from Japan in World War II. His parents lived behind the fences that they erected. But he was born during World War II. And he went on to become a 2-star retired general, Yokomura, in the U.S. Army, and held the highest position for an Asian American that the Army had. And we sat down for lunch here several months ago talking about these things. Well, we kind of like, okay, let me tell you my story. And then he tells my story and so on. But here's what he said to me. He said, Dick, you know what? He says, I get asked often, why am I not angry? And why am I like me, he's not going to retire. He's working in the veterans program up in Chicago. He says 3 things. He says, I have my faith, I have my family, and you and I know that we live in the greatest country on earth. And I won't allow that to take away my joy. And I said, you know, Jim, I tell you what, I'm going to be saying that, and I'm going to tell everybody about it too. And so that's it, you know, and I think that's what we grab a hold. So that's what one of the books said. The other book is called Woman, A Godly Creation. My mother was a single parent. She had 6 kids and left alone at age 36 in the Deep South. And one of those kids was a very precocious, intransigent, that's a big word, I couldn't spell it, but I was it, okay? And I was not going to bow down to what I was being issued. She prayed a lot and cried a lot and asked everybody to pray a lot and help her raise this one boy out of these 6 kids that might amount to something. And I remember my aunt came over one day and said, Daisy, he's going to hell anyway, why don't we just kill him and send him out early? She just turned 97 down in Louisiana, living in the same house we built way back in the 1950s. And she tells me she loves me dearly. But because of women like that, I wrote this book. Because women have done so much in this world. And it isn't just black women. It's women around the world. I write stories about women. You know, Golda Meir, you know, Madame Pierre, okay. Of course, I tell the personal story of working with Coretta Scott King. And then I tell the story about the love of my life in that book as well. It'd be crazy if I didn't write about her in the book, right? I mean, you're crazy, but I'm not foolish. So I wrote about the love of my life in this book. But I wrote it because women have done so much. And the world is so much better because God created women. And I take it back to the very genesis of that. And I give you a journey of what it really means. And it's meant to inspire, especially younger men, younger women, and younger men, and get them to better appreciate the women in our lives, the women in our society, and so on. So it's my way of honoring the women that I've met and known. It talks about nurses in Vietnam in 1966. You know, it talks about the young woman who lost her husband in 9/11. You know, her kids went to school. Her husband died in the airplane crash in Pennsylvania. Her husband went to school with my kids at the academy. You know, it tells a story about a nurse in World War II who lost her sweetheart just before the war ended. They were over in the Pacific. And she was waiting for him. He gave her a ring, and they were going to get married and come home and live happily ever after. He never made it back. That ring was carried by her for over 50 years. And when her granddaughter got married, she brought the ring out and presented it to her granddaughter. And thus the story became known of who she was and what she had done. She came back to America and took in a daughter that was really her niece. Her sister died, so she got double tragedy. And she did many marvelous things as a nurse all of her life, and worked right up until the time she could hardly walk. I interviewed this lady when she was 96, and I wrote her story in this book. Her name is Mary Clark Smith. I think it was Mary Ruth Clark. A lovely story of humanness. And it's stories like that in this book that I call Woman, A Godly Creation. So there's all kinds of stories like that, but it's to honor things that God has done through women. That's it. Okay? I'll be happy to autograph a copy back here if you, afterwards, and,
We have something for you.
okay? All right, sir. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I appreciate it.
Hey, Lynn, before I do this, why don't you tell us a little bit, you bought his first book,
I have not had a chance to read it yet
no,
myself.
but what did your dad say?
My dad said it was wonderful. He really enjoyed it. My dad was in Vietnam in '71, so in Ubon, Thailand. But anyway, I mean, since they're about the same age, my dad's 80, and I thought my dad would really love it, and he really did.
Thank you.
He could relate to all the different stages of your life.
Yes.
He really enjoyed it.
Good. Well, tell him I appreciate his comments back, okay?
I'm going to get it from him
Okay.
and borrow it.
We have a small token of our appreciation.
Oh, wow. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Well, that's great. Desert Warrior.
Yeah, and the Luke Museum. And I had sent you a copy of our PowerPoint as to what we want to do with the
Yes,
museum.
yes.
I noticed you mentioned that the Tuskegee Airmen, there was nothing dedicated
Yeah.
to them.
We need to fix that. I'll help you. Okay. All right. Thank you very much.
But it's all education
You bet, you bet.
based.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks
you.
again for coming.
All right. Thank you.
And we'll take a picture of you and we'll kind of gather around the table.